They were told Americans were demons who would torture them until they begged for death. The propaganda films had shown barbaric soldiers with cruel eyes and savage hearts who delighted in causing suffering. But when 67 Japanese women stepped off the transport ship at Seattle's harbor on August 20, 1945, expecting to face monsters, they found themselves staring at men who looked like they had stepped out of Hollywood movies, tall, clean-shaven, with kind eyes and gentle smiles. Nurse Keiko Tanaka, translator Yuki Sato, and radio operator Michiko Hayashi had prepared themselves for torture, starvation, and death. Instead, they were greeted by American soldiers who offered them hot coffee, clean blankets, and words of reassurance in broken Japanese. The disconnect between everything they had been taught and everything they were experiencing was so profound that some of the women thought they were dreaming. What happened next would shatter every belief these women held about their enemies, challenge everything they understood about propaganda and truth, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is not a bomb or a bullet, but simple human kindness that makes hatred impossible to sustain. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These accounts reveal how individual acts of compassion can overcome years of indoctrination and change hearts across enemy lines. The morning fog hung low over Elliott Bay as the transport ship USS General Mitchell approached Seattle's harbor, carrying its cargo of 67 Japanese women who had been captured during the final months of the Pacific War. These were not ordinary prisoners, they were educated, skilled professionals who had served in various capacities supporting the Japanese war effort. Among them was Keiko Tanaka, a 28-year-old nurse from Hiroshima who had treated wounded Japanese soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. Keiko had volunteered for overseas duty partly from patriotic duty and partly to escape the increasing desperation in Japan as Allied bombing intensified and food became scarce. Yuki Sato, 24, had been one of Japan's most skilled interpreters, fluent in English, Chinese, and Korean. She had worked for Japanese intelligence services, translating captured American documents and interrogating Allied prisoners. Yuki took pride in her linguistic abilities and her service to the emperor, but she had also developed a secret fascination with American culture through the enemy documents she translated. Michiko Hayashi, 26, was a radio operator who had coordinated communications between Japanese units across the Pacific Theater. She had grown up listening to American jazz music on shortwave radio before the war, developing a love for American music that she had carefully hidden from authorities who considered such interests treasonous. All three women, along with their 64 companions, had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Japanese propaganda about American brutality and racial superiority. They had been taught that Americans were subhuman beasts who took pleasure in torturing prisoners, especially Japanese women. They expected rape, murder, and degradation at the hands of their captors. As the ship approached the dock, the women huddled together in the hold, many crying, others praying, all preparing for the worst possible treatment. They had heard stories about American prisoner camps where Japanese soldiers were starved, beaten, and forced to perform humiliating tasks. They assumed their fate would be even worse as women in enemy hands. But as the ship's doors opened and American soldiers boarded to escort them off the vessel, the women experienced their first shock of cognitive dissonance. The Americans who came aboard were nothing like the brutal monsters they had been told to expect. The first impression that shattered everything. Staff Sergeant Robert "Bob" McKenzie, 29, from Portland, Oregon, was the first American the women encountered as they were brought up from the ship's hold. Bob was tall, clean-shaven, and wearing a freshly pressed uniform. He spoke in a gentle voice and made an effort to bow respectfully in Japanese fashion when he greeted them. "Ladies," Bob said in carefully practiced Japanese phrases, "welcome to America. You are safe now. No one will hurt you." Keiko stared at Bob in amazement. He was nothing like the Americans in Japanese propaganda films. Instead of the crude, violent savage she had expected, Bob looked like the American movie stars she had secretly admired in films that had been smuggled into Japan before the war. He was handsome, well-groomed, and spoke with a kindness that seemed genuine. The other soldiers who came aboard were equally surprising. They were polite, professional, and showed no signs of the sadistic cruelty the women had been conditioned to expect. Several soldiers offered to help carry the women's belongings, treating them with a courtesy that was completely inconsistent with everything the women thought they knew about American character. Yuki found herself comparing the Americans to the Hollywood actors she had seen in contraband movies. These soldiers had the same clean-cut appearance, the same confident but non-threatening demeanor, the same easy smiles that had made American cinema so appealing to audiences worldwide. But most shocking of all was the absence of hatred or contempt in the Americans' eyes. The Japanese women had been taught that Americans despised Japanese people as racially inferior subhumans. Yet these soldiers looked at them with what appeared to be sympathy and professional respect. As the women were escorted off the ship, they noticed details that further contradicted their expectations. The American soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and seemed healthy and strong. Their uniforms were clean and well-maintained. Their equipment was modern and functional. Everything about them suggested a military force that was successful, confident, and well-supplied. This was nothing like the desperate, barbaric enemy force Japanese propaganda had described. The welcome that defied all expectations. The processing center at Seattle's harbor had been prepared specifically for the arrival of Japanese civilian prisoners, with interpreters, medical staff, and administrative personnel trained to handle the psychological and practical needs of people who had been traumatized by capture and transportation. Captain Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American officer who spoke fluent Japanese, was responsible for coordinating the initial processing of the women. Captain Chen understood that these prisoners would be terrified and disoriented, expecting the worst possible treatment from their American captors. "I want everyone to understand," Captain Chen told her staff before the women arrived, "these people have been told that we are monsters. Their first impressions of how we treat them will determine everything about their time in our custody. We need to show them immediately that they are safe and will be treated with dignity." When the women were brought into the processing center, they found themselves in a clean, well-lit facility with tables set up for registration, medical examination, and assignment of temporary quarters. Instead of the cramped, dirty prison conditions they expected, they saw an organized operation designed to process people efficiently while treating them humanely. Each woman was assigned a number and given a card with her name written in both Japanese and English. They were told that they would be housed at Camp Harmony, a facility outside Seattle that had been converted from a Japanese-American internment camp into a prisoner-of-war facility for Japanese civilians. The medical examinations were conducted by American military doctors and nurses who treated the women with the same professional courtesy they would show any patients. The women were checked for injuries, illness, and malnutrition, and those who needed medical attention were provided with treatment immediately. Keiko, with her medical background, was particularly surprised by the quality of American medical care and the professional manner of the medical staff. She had expected rough treatment and minimal medical attention. Instead, she received a thorough examination, treatment for minor injuries she had sustained during her capture, and reassurance that her health would be monitored throughout her imprisonment. But the most shocking part of the processing was when the women were told about the conditions they could expect at Camp Harmony. They would be housed in dormitory-style barracks with beds, clean linens, and adequate heating. They would receive 3 meals per day, medical care, and opportunities for recreation and education. They would even be paid a small wage for work they performed in the camp. This was so different from what they had expected that many of the women assumed they were being lied to in order to make them compliant before the real brutality began. The camp that challenged every assumption. Camp Harmony, located in the Puyallup Valley south of Seattle, had originally been constructed in 1942 to house Japanese Americans who were being relocated from the West Coast. After the Japanese American internees were moved to more permanent facilities, the camp had been converted for use as a prisoner-of-war facility for Japanese civilians. The irony was not lost on the camp's administrators that they were now housing Japanese nationals in a facility that had originally been used to imprison American citizens of Japanese ancestry. But the current use of the camp was guided by different principles and policies than had governed its original purpose. When the transport convoy arrived at Camp Harmony on the evening of August 20, the women got their first look at what would be their home for the indefinite future. The camp consisted of long, wooden barracks buildings surrounded by a fence, with guard towers and gates that clearly marked it as a detention facility. But as they were processed into the camp, the women discovered conditions that continued to defy their expectations. The barracks were clean, heated, and equipped with beds that had real mattresses and clean linens. Each woman was assigned a footlocker for personal belongings and given a set of clean civilian clothes to replace the worn, dirty clothing they had been wearing since their capture. The dining hall was perhaps the most shocking discovery. Instead of the meager rations they expected, the women found themselves eating hot, nutritious meals that included meat, vegetables, and even desserts. The food was better than what many of them had eaten in Japan during the final months of the war, when rationing had reduced most civilians to near-starvation diets. Keiko found herself crying during her first meal at Camp Harmony, not from sadness or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that her enemies were treating her better than her own government had been able to provide for its citizens during the final months of the war. The dining hall also provided the women with their first opportunity to interact casually with American personnel. The guards and kitchen staff were friendly and professional, treating the women as human beings rather than dangerous enemies or objects of hatred. Several guards made efforts to communicate with the women in basic Japanese, and some of the women began attempting to practice their English with sympathetic Americans. These interactions revealed that the Americans were curious about Japanese culture and interested in the women as individuals, rather than viewing them as faceless representatives of an enemy nation. The transformation through small kindnesses. The most profound changes in the women's perceptions of Americans came not through grand gestures but through countless small acts of kindness and consideration that gradually eroded their preconceptions about American character and intentions. The first major breakthrough came when the women were allowed to take hot showers with soap and clean towels. For women who had been living in increasingly primitive conditions during the final months of the war, the luxury of hot water and soap was almost overwhelming. Michiko later wrote in her diary, "I stood under the hot water and cried. I had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. The American soap smelled like flowers, lavender, I think. In Japan, we had been using ash and sand to wash. I could not understand why our enemies would provide us with luxuries that our own people could no longer afford." The American personnel also made efforts to accommodate Japanese cultural preferences and sensitivities. The women were provided with privacy for bathing and dressing, their dietary restrictions were respected as much as possible, and they were allowed to practice their religious observances without interference. Captain Chen established regular meetings with representatives of the women to address concerns and suggestions about camp life. These meetings revealed that the Americans were genuinely interested in ensuring that the women were comfortable and treated fairly, rather than simply warehousing them until they could be repatriated. The women were also surprised to discover that they would be allowed to send and receive mail from Japan, subject to censorship. This policy allowed them to maintain contact with their families and learn about conditions in their homeland, but it also created new psychological challenges as they began to understand the extent of Japan's defeat and the suffering of the Japanese people. Perhaps most importantly, the women were treated as individuals rather than as a faceless group of enemy prisoners. American staff learned their names, showed interest in their backgrounds and skills, and treated them with the same basic courtesy they would show to any group of people under their care. These small kindnesses had a cumulative effect that was more powerful than any propaganda in changing the women's perceptions of their captors and their understanding of the war they had been fighting. The cultural exchange that opened minds. As the weeks passed at Camp Harmony, informal cultural exchanges began to develop between the Japanese women and their American guards and administrators. These interactions provided both groups with insights into each other's cultures and perspectives that challenged stereotypes and preconceptions on both sides. Yuki, with her linguistic skills and natural curiosity, became one of the primary bridges between the Japanese women and the American staff. She began translating not just official communications but also casual conversations and cultural explanations that helped both groups understand each other better. The Americans were particularly interested in learning about Japanese culture, asking questions about Japanese customs, food, music, and daily life that revealed genuine curiosity rather than hostility or contempt. Many Americans expressed surprise at the sophistication and complexity of Japanese culture, having been exposed primarily to wartime propaganda that portrayed Japanese people as primitive and fanatical. The women, in turn, were fascinated by American popular culture and technology. They were amazed by American efficiency, the quality of American manufactured goods, and the apparent prosperity that allowed even ordinary soldiers to have access to luxuries that were unimaginable in wartime Japan. Movie nights became particularly important cultural events. The camp administration arranged weekly screenings of American films, which provided the women with insights into American values, humor, and social norms. The women were surprised to discover that American movies often portrayed themes of individual freedom, social justice, and opposition to tyranny that contradicted Japanese propaganda about American imperialism and brutality. Michiko was particularly affected by American music. The camp had a small library of records that included jazz, swing, and popular music that reminded her of the American broadcasts she had secretly listened to before the war. She began to understand that the cultural products she had admired were expressions of the same society that was now treating her with unexpected kindness. The women also had opportunities to share aspects of Japanese culture with interested Americans. Keiko taught basic Japanese language lessons to several guards and nurses. Other women demonstrated traditional Japanese crafts, cooking techniques, and cultural practices that fascinated their American hosts. These cultural exchanges created personal relationships that transcended the formal prisoner-guard dynamic and helped both groups see each other as complex human beings rather than one-dimensional enemies. The moment that changed everything. The most profound transformation in the women's understanding of Americans came during an incident in November 1945 that challenged everything they thought they knew about American character and the nature of their captivity. A group of American soldiers had been brought to the camp's medical facility after being injured in a training accident. The injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and the camp's medical staff was overwhelmed with treating multiple casualties simultaneously. Keiko, observing the situation from her work assignment in the medical facility, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She approached the head medical officer and offered to assist in treating the wounded American soldiers, using her professional nursing skills to help care for men who had recently been her enemies. The offer created a moment of tension and uncertainty. The American medical staff had to decide whether to accept help from an enemy prisoner, while Keiko had to overcome her own conditioning about helping the enemy and her fear that her offer might be misinterpreted as an attempt to harm the patients. Captain William Morrison, the chief medical officer, made the decision to accept Keiko's help. "A nurse is a nurse," he said simply. "These men need medical care, and you have the skills to provide it." For the next 6 hours, Keiko worked alongside American medical personnel to treat wounded American soldiers. She cleaned wounds, administered medications, monitored vital signs, and provided the same professional medical care she would have given to Japanese patients. The American medical staff was impressed by Keiko's competence and professionalism, but more importantly, they were moved by her willingness to provide compassionate care to men who had been her enemies just months earlier. The wounded soldiers were equally affected by Keiko's care. Several of them thanked her personally for her help, expressing gratitude that transcended national boundaries and military affiliations. Word of Keiko's actions spread throughout the camp, creating ripple effects that changed relationships between the Japanese women and their American captors. The incident demonstrated that the boundaries between enemy and friend, us and them, were not as absolute as wartime propaganda had suggested. For Keiko, treating wounded Americans was a transformative experience that completed her psychological evolution from enemy prisoner to human being sharing common cause with other human beings who were suffering and in need of help. The letters that revealed a different war. As mail service between Camp Harmony and Japan was established, the women began receiving letters from family and friends that provided them with their first detailed information about conditions in their homeland during the final months of the war and the early occupation period. The letters painted a picture of Japan that was very different from what the women were experiencing in American captivity. Their families described widespread hunger, destruction from Allied bombing, shortages of basic necessities, and social chaos as Japanese society struggled to adapt to defeat and occupation. Michiko received a letter from her sister in Tokyo that described conditions in the Japanese capital. The city is mostly rubble. We are eating grass and tree bark to survive. Many people have died from starvation and disease. The American occupation forces provide some food, but it is not enough. I envy your situation as a prisoner. You are probably eating better than we are here in supposedly free Japan. The contrast between conditions in Japan and conditions at Camp Harmony created complex emotional responses among the women. They felt guilty about their relatively comfortable circumstances while their families and friends were suffering. They also felt confused about the moral implications of being treated better by their enemies than their own people had been treated by their own government. Yuki struggled with particularly complicated feelings as she translated letters for other women who were not fluent in Japanese writing. Many of the letters described family members who had died from starvation, disease, or suicide during the final months of the war. The women were learning that their country's defeat had been far more complete and devastating than they had understood while they were being captured. The letters also revealed that American occupation forces in Japan were generally behaving with restraint and providing humanitarian assistance to the Japanese population. This contradicted everything the women had been taught about what would happen if Americans conquered Japan. As the women processed this information, they began to understand that the kindness they were experiencing at Camp Harmony was not exceptional treatment designed to manipulate them, but rather a reflection of American values and policies that extended to their treatment of all Japanese people, including those in Japan itself. This realization forced the women to confront fundamental questions about the war they had supported, the government they had served, and the propaganda they had believed. The Christmas that sealed the transformation. Christmas 1945 at Camp Harmony became a defining moment in the relationship between the Japanese women and their American captors, demonstrating the extent to which mutual understanding and respect had developed during their months together. The camp administration, led by Captain Chen and Chaplain Robert Stevens, decided to organize a Christmas celebration that would include both American personnel and Japanese prisoners. The decision was controversial among some military officials who questioned the appropriateness of celebrating an American holiday with enemy prisoners. But Captain Chen argued that the celebration would serve important humanitarian and diplomatic purposes. These women are going to return to Japan eventually, she explained. How they remember their treatment here will influence Japanese attitudes toward America for years to come. Showing them American generosity and inclusion will serve our long-term interests better than maintaining artificial barriers. The women were initially uncertain about participating in a Christian celebration, but their curiosity about American culture and their appreciation for American kindness motivated most of them to participate. The celebration featured traditional American Christmas foods, decorations, and music, but it also included elements that acknowledged and respected Japanese culture. The women contributed Japanese songs and cultural presentations that enriched the celebration and demonstrated the possibility of cultural exchange and mutual appreciation. Keiko found herself singing Christmas carols in English alongside American soldiers who had been strangers just months earlier but who now felt like friends and colleagues. The experience was emotionally overwhelming as she realized how completely her understanding of Americans and America had changed. The gifts that were exchanged during the celebration were particularly meaningful. American personnel gave the women small personal items, photographs, books, jewelry, and handicrafts, that represented friendship and personal connection rather than mere charity. The women, in turn, created handmade gifts for their American friends, using traditional Japanese crafts and techniques to express their gratitude and affection for people who had shown them unexpected kindness. Yuki received a Japanese-English dictionary from Lieutenant James Patterson, who had been studying Japanese with her help. The inscription read, "To help you build bridges between our peoples. Thank you for teaching me that enemies can become friends." The Christmas celebration became a symbol of the transformation that had occurred at Camp Harmony, where artificial barriers created by war and propaganda had been replaced by genuine human connections based on mutual respect and understanding. The decision that nobody expected. In early 1946, as plans were being made for the repatriation of Japanese civilians to their homeland, the women at Camp Harmony faced a decision that none of them had anticipated when they first arrived as prisoners. Several American families and organizations had expressed interest in sponsoring Japanese women who wanted to remain in the United States rather than return to the devastation and uncertainty of post-war Japan. The sponsorship arrangements would provide the women with opportunities to work, study, and eventually apply for permanent residency in America. The offer created intense debates among the women about loyalty, identity, and their obligations to their families and homeland. For women who had been raised with strong cultural values about duty and national identity, the possibility of choosing American life over Japanese life raised profound moral and emotional questions. Keiko was torn between her desire to continue developing her medical career in America, where opportunities for women professionals were greater than in traditional Japanese society, and her sense of obligation to return to Japan to help with reconstruction and to reunite with her family. Yuki saw opportunities in America to use her linguistic skills in ways that could bridge the gap between American and Japanese cultures, potentially helping to prevent future conflicts through improved understanding and communication. Michiko was attracted to American freedoms and opportunities, but she also felt guilty about abandoning her homeland during its time of greatest need. In the end, 23 of the 67 women chose to accept American sponsorship and remain in the United States. The other 44 women, including Keiko, Yuki, and Michiko, chose to return to Japan, but with transformed perspectives that would influence their contributions to post-war Japanese society. The women who stayed in America became pioneers in Japanese-American relations, using their unique experiences to build cultural and economic bridges between the two countries. Their success in American society provided living proof that former enemies could become productive and valued members of American communities. The women who returned to Japan carried with them new understanding of American character and values that contradicted the stereotypes and propaganda that had contributed to the conflict between the two nations. The return to a transformed homeland. In March 1946, the 44 women who chose repatriation boarded a transport ship in Seattle Harbor for the journey back to Japan. As they left Camp Harmony, many of them wept, not from joy at returning home, but from sadness at leaving friends and a place where they had discovered new understanding of themselves and the world. The journey back to Japan provided the women with time to reflect on their experiences and to prepare themselves for reunion with families and a society that had been transformed by defeat and occupation. They knew they would face questions about their treatment by Americans and suspicion about their changed attitudes toward their former enemies. When their ship arrived in Yokohama Harbor, the women got their first direct look at the devastation that had been wrought on Japan during the final months of the war. The harbor facilities were damaged, the surrounding city was largely destroyed, and the people they saw looked thin, poorly dressed, and demoralized. The contrast with the prosperity and efficiency they had witnessed in America was stark and disturbing. Keiko wrote in her diary, "I had forgotten how poor and damaged Japan had become. In America, even as prisoners, we lived better than free Japanese citizens are living now in our own country." The repatriation process itself reflected the changed relationship between Japan and America. American occupation personnel processed the returning women with efficiency and courtesy, treating them as returnees rather than as former enemies being expelled from American territory. Japanese authorities, supervised by American occupation officials, welcomed the women back but also questioned them extensively about their experiences in American captivity. The women's positive accounts of their treatment were met with skepticism by some Japanese officials who found it difficult to believe that Americans had treated Japanese prisoners with genuine kindness. The women's families were eager to hear about their experiences, but many family members were also suspicious of the women's changed attitudes and their apparent appreciation for American culture and values. Keiko reunited with her family in Hiroshima, finding that her parents had survived the atomic bombing but were living in temporary housing and struggling with poverty and illness. Her positive memories of American medical care and efficiency contrasted sharply with the limited medical resources available in post-war Japan. Yuki returned to Tokyo, where she found her family's home destroyed and her parents working menial jobs to survive. Her linguistic skills and her understanding of American culture made her valuable to Japanese businesses and government agencies that were trying to rebuild relationships with the United States. Michiko returned to Osaka, where she used her knowledge of American technology and systems to help rebuild Japanese communications infrastructure with American assistance and guidance. The legacy that bridged two worlds. The 67 Japanese women who had been brought to Seattle as prisoners in 1945 became unexpected ambassadors for improved Japanese-American relations during the crucial post-war period when the relationship between the two countries was being rebuilt on new foundations. The women who remained in America became successful members of American society, contributing to fields ranging from medicine and education to business and cultural exchange. Their success demonstrated that Japanese people could integrate successfully into American society while maintaining their cultural identity and heritage. The women who returned to Japan became advocates for reconciliation and cooperation with the United States. Their first-hand knowledge of American character and values provided credible testimony that contradicted wartime propaganda and helped Japanese society develop more realistic and positive attitudes toward their former enemies. Keiko used her medical training and her understanding of American medical practices to help modernize Japanese healthcare during the Reconstruction period. She became a leader in Japanese nursing education and helped establish exchange programs that brought Japanese medical professionals to America for training. Yuki became a prominent translator and cultural interpreter, facilitating business and diplomatic relationships between Japan and the United States. Her work helped American companies understand Japanese culture and business practices while helping Japanese organizations adapt to American methods and technologies. Michiko joined the Japanese broadcasting industry, where she used her knowledge of American media and communications technology to help modernize Japanese radio and television. She became an advocate for cultural exchange programs that promoted mutual understanding between Japanese and American peoples. The women's experiences at Camp Harmony became part of the historical record of Japanese-American relations, providing evidence that even in wartime, humanitarian treatment of prisoners could contribute to long-term peace and reconciliation between former enemies. Their stories were documented by historians and journalists who recognized the significance of their transformation from fearful prisoners expecting brutality to advocates for international understanding and cooperation. Perhaps most importantly, the women's experiences demonstrated that propaganda and stereotypes could be overcome through personal contact and genuine human kindness, providing a model for how former enemies could become friends and allies. The enduring lesson of human connection. The broader significance of the story of the 67 Japanese women extends beyond the specific historical context of World War II and Japanese-American relations to fundamental questions about human nature, the power of propaganda, and the possibility for reconciliation after conflict. The women's experiences demonstrated that people's attitudes toward their supposed enemies could be transformed completely when they encountered genuine kindness and respect instead of the brutality and hatred they had been conditioned to expect. Their transformation was not the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation or political indoctrination, but simply the natural human response to being treated with dignity and compassion by people who could have justifiably viewed them as enemies deserving of punishment. The story illustrated the power of individual actions and personal relationships to overcome institutional barriers and historical animosities. The American personnel at Camp Harmony had created conditions that allowed authentic human connections to develop across cultural and political boundaries. The women's experiences also demonstrated the importance of treating prisoners and enemies with humanity, not just for moral reasons but for practical political purposes. The kindness they experienced as prisoners influenced their attitudes toward America for the rest of their lives and contributed to building positive relationships between Japan and the United States during the post-war period. Perhaps most importantly, their story showed that propaganda and stereotypes, no matter how deeply ingrained, could be overcome through direct personal experience and genuine human contact. The women had been taught that Americans were demons, but they discovered that Americans were human beings capable of kindness, compassion, and respect for people who had been their enemies. This transformation was not unique to these particular women or this particular conflict, but represented a universal human capacity for growth, understanding, and reconciliation when people are given opportunities to see beyond the artificial barriers created by politics and war. So here's the question their story poses: in your own life, what assumptions do you hold about people you consider your opponents or enemies? How might those assumptions change if you had genuine personal contact with those people? And what opportunities do you have to extend the kind of kindness and respect that could transform someone else's understanding of who you are and what you represent? The 67 Japanese women who expected demons and found human beings proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred and misunderstanding is simply treating other people with the dignity and compassion that all human beings deserve, regardless of their nationality, their politics, or their past actions.